This video will begin our journey through the brain. We're going to start at the base of the brain in what's called the hindbrain. So there are three major divisions of the brain: the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. And we'll go through the different regions contained within these different divisions. We're going to start in this video in the hindbrain. So this image here is showing you what's contained within the hindbrain. We have the pons, the medulla, and the cerebellum. We also have some ascending and descending tracts that we'll also discuss, called the reticular formation and the raphe formation. So the medulla, seen here, sits right atop the spinal cord. So if we were to continue on down, this would be the spinal cord. And so the medulla is really just an extension of the spinal cord, an easy way of looking at it. And the medulla, it's here in the hindbrain, and the hindbrain is the seat of kind of very basic functions. If you look in lower animal species, you'll see that our hindbrain is very similar to theirs because we all need these basic functions in order to survive, to live. And so the medulla's basic function that it's important for are vital reflexes. So now these vital reflexes, think about what types of reflexes, things that you don't think about that help keep you alive. Your breathing. It just, it happens, right? We don't tell ourselves to breathe at a certain rate. Our heart rate. Vomiting. Vomiting is important for getting up something that might be toxic to us. Salivation, coughing, sneezing. All of those are vital reflexes. And so the medulla controls these. Now I want to point out that here we're talking about vital reflexes. Vital meaning they're important for our survival. We're going to talk about vital drives in another brain region, so make sure you keep those separate. Here we're talking about things that are very reflexive, things that we don't have a lot of control over. And damage to the medulla can be fatal. So sometimes if you have a very high spinal cord injury, it may damage the medulla as well because if we have these vital reflexes. So imagine if it's damaged and your breathing and heart rate can't be controlled anymore. Large doses of opiates can actually suppress the medulla and be life-threatening in terms of, so that our breathing is suppressed to too low of an amount to maintain survival. So down here in the medulla, we also have what are called cranial nerves. So we talked about those motor nerves down in the spinal cord. Well, in the head and the neck area, we have cranial nerves that control the movement. And each cranial nerve originates in a cluster of neurons, and there's 12 pairs with one on each side. And we're really not going to go into a whole much more detail about the cranial nerves. If you go on and you take an anatomy class, not a neuroanatomy class, but maybe in a neuroanatomy class, you'll learn more about those cranial nerves. So now we're at the pons. So the pons is this kind of like bulbar structure that sits atop the medulla. And it's a little circular structure, kind of pokes out there a little bit beyond the medulla. And along with the medulla, it contains some ascending and descending tracts. And this one in particular I'm pointing out here is the reticular formation, but also has the raphe system, which we'll discuss on a few other slides. So the pons, again, in that hindbrain, our hindbrains, again, like I said previously, very similar to lower animal species. And so again, things that are very basic that we all need to survive. The pons is going to control things like sleeping, waking, dreaming. So we'll come back and talk more about the pons when we talk about sleep in a later chapter. Next, we have the reticular formation. So the reticular formation, the descending portion is one of the several brain areas that control the motor areas of the spinal cord. So we have a descending, going down into the spinal cord, part of the reticular formation, and then we have an ascending portion. And so that ascending portion is it's an output to much of the cerebral cortex up here. And it basically, one of its jobs is to increase arousal and attention. And so as incoming sensory information is coming up from the spinal cord, the reticular formation senses that and sends signals to the cortex to arouse it, to promote readiness for the arrival of that sensory information. And again, because it's important in arousal and attention, we'll talk about it more when we cover sleep in a later chapter. Now the raphe nuclei here, again, you see them in the pons and some in the medulla area. The raphe system also sends axons to much of the cerebral cortex, again, promoting its readiness to respond to stimuli. So again, prepping that cerebral cortex to respond to that incoming sensory information. Now the cerebellum is like its own little mini brain back here. And so it sits behind the pons and the medulla, kind of underneath that cerebral cortex, just tucked in a little bit. And it helps to regulate motor, movement, balance, and coordination. And so, not to get you confused, but later on we're going to talk about the motor cortex up here. And the motor cortex is going to issue the orders to the motor neurons in the spinal cord to promote movement. However, what the cerebellum does is kind of fine-tunes that movement. So when the motor cortex issues its orders to the muscles, it also sends a copy of that information to the cerebellum. So the motor cortex is going to send information down to those motor neurons in the spinal cord, but it's also going to send a copy here to the cerebellum. So it can coordinate that movement and balance. And we'll talk more about the cerebellum when we get to the movement chapter. But just think about it as your motor cortex issues orders to walk in a straight line. Your cerebellum is going to allow you to actually walk in a straight line. Your motor cortex issues orders to move your finger to touch your nose. Your cerebellum is going to make sure that that finger actually touches your nose and doesn't touch off to the side. It helps, a gymnast walk across a balance beam. It helps an acrobat walk across a tightrope. But it's also will learn important things like aim, timing, rhythm, any sport really that requires aim and timing and rhythm is going to be utilizing that cerebellum. We also know that it's important in shifting attention between auditory and visual stimuli and remembering simple skills and acquired reflexes. So this is another one that we'll come back and talk about. You may remember classical conditioning from Psych 100 level class. And so that classical conditioning is controlled by cells within that cerebellum. So, and again, the cerebellum, we mentioned this before, but it has more cells than the entire nervous system combined, suggesting that it probably has a lot more roles than we're discussing here. And we've just kind of scratched the surface. One thing that's come out recently that I read about is that it potentially has some sort of reward system. So when we talk about rewards and drugs and addiction, we're going to talk about the nucleus accumbens. But now there's this other area that maybe it's a competing reward system, maybe it's a backup reward system, whatever it is, that the cerebellum appears to control. And just to finish up with this video, just to mention the brainstem. And so the brainstem, we're going to say, involves the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the thalamus. And so it's this little snapshot here kind of enlarged. It doesn't include the cerebellum, but in different textbooks, sometimes different brain regions are put together to be that brainstem. So just kind of keep that in mind. For this textbook, what we're going to talk about as the brainstem is this hindbrain, the midbrain, and the thalamus, minus the cerebellum, of course.